The most dangerous woman in the room is the one who doesn't need anything from you. The chandeliers stretched across the ballroom like a sky of controlled fire, each crystal catching light and throwing it back in precise, calculated brilliance, just like the man standing beneath them. Ethan Whitmore didn't just attend events like this, he owned them without saying a word, his presence measured in quiet glances, subtle shifts, the way conversations paused half a second too long when he moved. His tailored suit fell perfectly against his frame. His watch caught the light just enough to remind everyone in the room what time it was, his time. Around him, executives leaned in, investors smiled too quickly, and women adjusted their posture as if proximity alone could change their future. This was his world, structured, predictable, governed by rules he never broke. No distractions, no attachments, no exceptions. And then there was her. Amara Cole moved through the edge of the room like she belonged to a different frequency entirely, her black dress simple, unbranded, untouched by the need to impress. She carried a tray for a moment, set it down, then stepped aside as if she had already decided where she did and didn't exist in this space. When Ethan entered her line of sight, she didn't react. No pause, no second glance, not even the reflexive acknowledgement everyone else gave without thinking. She just kept walking. It was small. It was nothing. And it was the only thing in the room that didn't make sense. Ethan's gaze followed her without permission, tracking the quiet confidence in her steps, the absence of performance in her posture. She wasn't trying to be unseen. She simply wasn't offering herself to be seen. That distinction landed somewhere deeper than it should have. A man beside him spoke about numbers, projections, expansion, but Ethan didn't hear a word. His attention had already shifted, locked onto the one variable he couldn't calculate. Across the room, Amara adjusted a glass that didn't need adjusting, her fingers steady, her movements deliberate, like someone who had learned to move through spaces without asking for permission. No hesitation, no invitation, just presence. Ethan broke his own rhythm before he realized it. Excusing himself mid-conversation, crossing the polished floor with the same controlled stride he used in boardrooms where millions were decided in minutes. The air shifted slightly as he approached her, not because of him, but because people noticed him noticing her. She didn't look up. Not when he stopped in front of her, not when the silence stretched just long enough to become visible. "You work here?" he asked, his voice low, even, designed to lead. Amara lifted her eyes then, not slowly, not dramatically, just enough to meet his gaze without offering anything beyond acknowledgement. "For tonight," she said. No smile, no softness, just truth. Ethan nodded once, studying her in a way that usually made people straighten, adjust, respond. She didn't. "What do you want?" he asked, the question instinctive, shaped by a lifetime where everything had a price, a motive, a reason. Amara held his gaze for half a second longer than necessary, then reached for a glass beside her, aligning it with the others, as if finishing a thought he wasn't part of. "Nothing you're used to giving," she said, calm, precise. The words didn't land loud, but they stayed. For the first time in a long time, Ethan Whitmore didn't have a response ready. And somewhere between the light, the silence, and the space she refused to fill for him, a rule he had never questioned before began to crack. The silence after her words did not break. It settled, heavy and precise, like something placed exactly where it was meant to be, and Ethan Whitmore stood there for a fraction longer than he ever allowed himself to linger anywhere that did not serve a purpose. His gaze fixed on Amara, as if the answer he was used to finding in seconds had decided not to exist this time, and that absence did something unfamiliar to him. It stayed. Around them the room continued in its orchestrated rhythm, glasses touched, laughter rose and fell, deals were hinted at in half-sentences, but none of it reached him the same way anymore, because for the first time in years, control had slipped not from his business, not from his image, but from his understanding, and that unsettled him more than any financial risk ever could. He exhaled slowly, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve out of habit, a small motion that usually reset his focus. But when he looked back at her, she had already stepped away, not abruptly, not to escape, simply because the moment, to her, was already finished. That should have been the end of it, a passing interaction filed away with thousands of others. But Ethan did not move, not immediately, his eyes tracking her again as she crossed toward the far side of the ballroom, where the light dimmed slightly and the crowd thinned, where people who were not meant to be seen did their work without drawing attention. And yet somehow she remained the most defined presence in the room. He turned only when someone called his name, a senior partner trying to pull him back into a conversation about a pending acquisition, numbers, timelines, expectations, all the things that usually commanded his full attention, and he responded as expected, voice steady, precise, every answer aligned. But there was a delay now, a half-second pause before each response, subtle enough that no one else noticed, but sharp enough that he did. Across the room, Amara continued moving through her tasks with the same quiet efficiency, adjusting, organizing, stepping in and out of conversations that were not hers, never inserting herself, never shrinking either. And that balance, that refusal to perform, began to pull at something he had never needed to question before. 20 minutes passed, maybe 30, time blurred in a way it never did for him. And then without announcing it, without asking permission from the version of himself that followed rules, Ethan stepped away from the group again. This time not because it was strategic, not because it was required, but because something unfinished had settled in his chest, and he was not used to leaving anything unresolved. He found her near a side table where the light from a tall window cut across the floor in clean lines, the city beyond it glowing in quiet contrast to the room behind them. And when he approached this time, he did not speak immediately. He simply stood beside her, not in front, not blocking her path, just close enough to exist in her space without claiming it. Amara noticed, not with a turn of her head, but with the smallest shift in her posture, a recognition without reaction. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the kind of silence that was not empty, but weighted with unasked questions. Ethan broke it, but softer now, less certain than before. "You turned down something most people would not think twice about," he said, his tone stripped of the usual edge of control, and she glanced at him, not surprised, not impressed, just aware. "Most people are used to needing it," she replied, her voice even, her words landing without force but carrying all the same. And he studied her again, this time not as a variable to understand, but as something he could not place inside the systems that had always worked for him. "And you are not," he said, more observation than question, and she shook her head once, a small, definitive movement. "No," she answered, and then after a beat, "I learned a long time ago that the things people offer usually come with something attached, and I am not interested in negotiating my peace." The sentence was simple, but it shifted something in the air between them, something that did not belong to contracts or leverage or control, and Ethan felt it, not as a loss, but as a space he had never considered before. For the first time, he did not try to fill it. He did not counter, did not persuade, did not adjust the terms. He simply stood there, the city lights reflecting faintly in the glass behind her, and realized that whatever this was, it was not something he could buy, not something he could direct, and not something he could solve in a single move. And that realization, quiet and unannounced, marked the first rule he had ever broken without even knowing how it happened. The music softened as the night stretched deeper, but something else had already shifted, something quieter than sound, heavier than presence, and Ethan Whitmore felt it follow him even after he stepped away from her, returning to conversations that now felt rehearsed, predictable, almost hollow in comparison to the clarity of a woman who had just refused everything he represented without raising her voice. He continued moving through the room, shaking hands, nodding at the right moments, offering measured responses that kept the structure intact. But there was a fracture now, small and invisible, in the way he processed everything around him, because for the first time in years, someone had stepped outside his system without asking to be let in, and that disruption did not fade. It stayed, pressing quietly at the edges of his focus. Across the ballroom, Amara finished her shift with the same steady rhythm she had carried all night, clearing the last of the glasses, exchanging a brief word with another staff member, then stepping toward the service exit as if the entire evening had passed without leaving a mark on her. And maybe for her it had, but for Ethan it had not. He noticed the moment she reached for the door, the subtle way she paused just long enough to adjust her sleeve, not out of nervousness, but out of habit, like someone who prepared to step back into a world that required nothing from anyone else. And before the door could close behind her, he moved. It was not rushed, not dramatic, just decisive. The kind of movement that had built empires. Except this time there was no strategy behind it. Only a question he could not ignore. The hallway beyond the ballroom was quieter. The hum of the event reduced to a distant echo, replaced by the soft buzz of overhead lights and the faint sound of footsteps against polished floors. And when he stepped through the door, he found her already halfway down the corridor, walking with the same unhurried pace, as if she had nowhere to prove and nothing to chase. "Amara," he called, the name landing unfamiliar on his tongue, and she stopped, not abruptly, just enough to acknowledge that she had heard him, then turned slightly, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady. He closed the distance between them, but slower this time, aware in a way he had not been before that proximity did not grant him access. And when he stopped a few feet away, he did not step closer. "You walked away," he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement he was still trying to understand, and she held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. "Yes," she answered simply, and the lack of explanation forced him to continue. "Most people would have stayed," he added, the words quieter now, less certain, and she tilted her head slightly, considering him without judgment. "Most people are waiting for something," she said, her voice calm. "An opportunity, approval, a way in." She paused just long enough for the meaning to settle. "I am not." The sentence landed clean, without resistance, and Ethan felt the weight of it in a way that had nothing to do with business or negotiation. He studied her again, but this time there was no attempt to categorize, no immediate response forming behind his eyes, just a quiet recognition that whatever defined her did not fit inside the rules he had built his life around. "Then what are you waiting for?" he asked, the question softer than anything he had asked all night. And for the first time, there was the slightest shift in her expression, not emotion exactly, but something closer to truth surfacing without defense. "Peace," she said, and the word, simple and unguarded, cut through the space between them with more precision than anything else she had said. Ethan did not speak right away, because there was nothing in his world that translated that answer into something measurable, something he could acquire, something he could offer. And for a moment, the silence returned, but this time it was different, not tense, not uncertain, just real. Amara adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder, a small motion that signaled the end of the moment on her terms, and when she turned to leave again, she did not wait for his response, did not ask for one, because she did not need it, and Ethan stood there, watching her walk down the corridor until she disappeared around the corner, the soft echo of her steps fading into nothing. He remained where he was for a second longer than necessary, the overhead lights casting a steady glow across the empty hallway, and in that stillness, he understood something he had never needed to consider before, that not every door could be opened by force. Not every connection could be initiated on his terms, and not every person could be drawn into his world simply because he decided they should be there. And as he turned back toward the ballroom, the weight of that realization did not feel like a loss. It felt like the beginning of something he did not yet understand, something that would require more than control to reach. And for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Whitmore did not have a plan. The ballroom felt different when Ethan stepped back in, not because anything had changed, but because he had, and that shift made everything else seem sharper, louder, almost exaggerated in its predictability as conversations resumed around him with the same polished cadence, the same calculated laughter, the same quiet negotiations disguised as casual exchanges, yet none of it held him the way it had just an hour ago. He moved through the space out of habit, acknowledging greetings, responding when necessary, but his attention was no longer anchored to outcomes. It drifted, returning again and again to a hallway that now stood empty and a woman who had walked away without hesitation by the time the event began to wind down. The music softening into background noise and the crowd thinning into clusters of final conversations. Ethan had already made a decision he could not explain, one that did not align with strategy or necessity, only with a quiet insistence that something unfinished needed to be understood. Outside, the night air carried a cool edge, the kind that settled into the skin and cleared the noise left behind by crowded rooms, and the city stretched wide under a grid of lights, steady, indifferent, moving forward without pause. Near the curb, a small group of staff gathered, waiting for rides, checking their phones, exchanging quiet remarks about the long evening. And among them, Amara stood slightly apart, her posture relaxed but self-contained, her attention on the street ahead rather than the people beside her. As if even in stillness she maintained the same boundaries she carried inside. Ethan approached without announcement, stopping a few steps away, not close enough to intrude, but not distant enough to remain unnoticed. And when she turned this time, there was no surprise in her expression, only recognition that he had chosen to follow the moment beyond where it naturally ended. "You came back," she said, not questioning, simply stating what was in front of her, and he nodded once, his hands resting at his sides instead of adjusting a cuff or checking a watch, small changes that spoke louder than words he had not yet formed. "You left," he replied, mirroring her tone, and for a second there was the faintest trace of something in her eyes, not amusement, not irritation, just acknowledgement of a symmetry neither of them had planned. The streetlight above them cast a soft glow, outlining the edges of their stillness while cars passed in quiet intervals, headlights sliding across the pavement like time moving forward whether they stepped with it or not. "I go where I am done," she said, her voice even, and the sentence carried no edge, no defense, just a boundary spoken without effort. Ethan took that in, the simplicity of it, the clarity, and for once he did not try to redirect the moment, did not shift it towards something he could control. Instead, he stayed where he was, allowing the silence to exist without filling it. "And you were done with me," he said, not as a challenge, but as a realization he was still learning how to hold, and she met his gaze steadily. "I was done with the conversation," she corrected, precise in a way that left no room for assumption, and something in that distinction landed deeper than anything else she had said, because it meant the door had not been closed out of rejection, but out of completion. A car pulled up at the curb. Someone from the group stepped forward, exchanging a quick goodbye before leaving, and the small movement around them contrasted with the stillness between them, as if the rest of the world continued on schedule while they remained suspended in a moment neither of them had planned to extend. Ethan glanced briefly toward the street, then back at her, and when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the weight it usually held in rooms designed to respond to him. It was quieter, more direct. "Then let me ask something without an offer attached," he said, and she watched him for a second longer this time, measuring not the words, but the intention behind them, before giving a slight nod. "What would it take for you not to walk away next time?" he asked, the question simple, but unfamiliar in the way it placed the decision entirely outside of his control. Amara exhaled softly, not as hesitation, but as someone choosing her words carefully because they mattered. "It would take you not trying to give me a reason to stay," she said, and the answer settled between them with a quiet finality that felt more honest than anything else that had been exchanged all night. Ethan did not respond immediately, because there was nothing in his world that aligned with that logic. Nothing that functioned without leverage, without incentive, without structure, and yet standing there under a streetlight instead of a chandelier, he understood something he had never needed to before, that whatever this was, it would not move forward on his terms alone. Amara shifted her weight slightly. As another car approached, the motion subtle but clear, signaling that her time in this space was reaching its natural end again. And when she stepped forward this time, she did not look back, not out of dismissal, but because she had already said everything she intended to say. Ethan remained where he was, watching as she entered the car and the door closed with a quiet final sound, the vehicle pulling away into the steady flow of the city. And for the first time, he did not follow, not because he did not want to, but because he was beginning to understand that not following might be the only way this did not end the same way everything else in his life always had, controlled, predictable, and empty. And as the car disappeared into the distance, the space she left behind did not feel like absence. It felt like a question, one that would not be answered by power, by money, or by rules, but by something he had never needed to learn until now. The next morning did not wait for clarity. It arrived with the same precision Ethan Whitmore had built his life around, sunlight cutting through the glass walls of his office in clean lines, the The city below, already in motion as if nothing had shifted the night before, but inside that quiet, controlled space, something had. He stood by the window longer than usual, not checking his watch, not reviewing numbers, just watching the steady rhythm of traffic move without hesitation. And for the first time in years, he found himself thinking about something that had no measurable outcome, no timeline, no clear return, just a conversation that had ended without resolution and a woman who had refused to be part of anything that required one. His phone buzzed on the desk behind him, a series of notifications stacking one after another, meetings, approvals, updates, all waiting for his attention, all demanding the version of him that always responded, always led, always decided, and he turned. Eventually, stepping back into that role with the same efficiency that had defined him for years, answering calls, signing off on decisions, moving through conversations with sharp precision. But there was a delay now, subtle and unspoken, in the way his mind processed everything, like a part of him was no longer fully present in the system he had mastered. By mid-morning, his assistant stood across from his desk, reviewing the schedule for the day, her voice steady, organized, outlining each commitment down to the minute, and he listened, nodding when necessary, until she paused, glancing at her tablet before adding something not originally on the list. "There is a staffing agency requesting confirmation for last night's event billing," she said, her tone neutral. They sent over the final roster, and without thinking, Ethan reached for the document, his eyes scanning the names quickly at first, then slowing when he found the one he was not supposed to be looking for. Amara Cole. It was just a name on a list, no different from the others, but it held his attention longer than anything else on the page, and that alone was enough to disrupt the pattern of his morning. "Approve it," he said, handing the tablet back, his voice even, but his mind no longer on the numbers attached to the request. The assistant nodded and moved on, the door closing behind her with a soft click that left the office in silence again, and Ethan sat back in his chair, the city stretching beyond the glass in front of him, but his focus narrowing instead of expanding. He had built a life where every connection had a function, every interaction a purpose, but this, whatever this was, did not fit, and instead of dismissing it, instead of categorizing it as irrelevant, he did something he had not done in a long time. He allowed it to stay. The rest of the day moved forward as expected, meetings blending into each other, decisions stacking, outcomes aligning. But the clarity he was known for carried a new edge, sharper, more deliberate, as if part of him was testing something unseen, something that did not belong to business or control. By late afternoon, the sun shifted lower, casting longer shadows across his office, and without announcing it, without attaching a reason to it, Ethan made a choice that had no place on his schedule. He stood, reached for his coat, and walked out without explanation, his assistant looking up in brief surprise before returning to her work, because in his world, he did not explain movements, he made them. The drive across the city took less than 20 minutes, but it felt longer, not because of traffic, but because for once, there was no clear outcome waiting at the end of it, just a location pulled from a line on a document and a question he had not been able to ignore since the night before. The building was modest, clean but unremarkable, the kind of place that existed without needing to be noticed, and when he stepped out of the car, the contrast between his world and hers was immediate, not in a way that created distance, but in a way that clarified it. He entered without hesitation, the quiet hum of a small lobby replacing the constant motion he was used to, and approached the front desk where a woman looked up, her expression polite but curious. "Can I help you?" she asked, and Ethan paused for the briefest moment, not because he did not know what to say, but because for the first time, he was stepping into a space where his name did not carry weight, where his presence did not automatically open doors. "I am looking for Amara Cole," he said, his voice steady, stripped of its usual authority, and the woman glanced down at her screen, then back at him. "She is not on shift today," she replied, simple, factual, and the answer landed without resistance, because it was not something he could change. Ethan nodded once, stepping back slightly, the stillness of the space settling around him, and for a moment, he considered leaving, returning to the structure that always responded to him, but instead he stayed, just long enough to recognize something he had never needed to before. That not finding her did not feel like failure. It felt like continuation, like something that was not meant to be resolved in a single move. And as he turned toward the door, the weight of that realization did not push him away. It pulled him forward into something slower, something unfamiliar, something that would require more than intention to reach. And for the first time, Ethan Whitmore did not try to speed it up. The next 2 days passed without interruption, at least on the surface, as Ethan Whitmore returned fully to the structure that had never failed him. Meetings aligned, decisions executed, numbers moved exactly where they were expected to go. And from the outside, nothing about him suggested that anything had shifted, but internally, there was a quiet persistence he could not dismiss, not loud enough to disrupt his performance, but steady enough to follow him through every room he entered, every conversation he led, every moment that would have once been complete on its own. He did not go back to the agency again, not immediately, not because he had lost interest, but because something in him had begun to understand that repetition would only turn this into something predictable. And predictability was exactly what had made everything else in his life so easy to control. Instead, he waited, not passively, but deliberately, allowing time to move without forcing it. Something that felt unfamiliar but not uncomfortable, like stepping into a rhythm he had never needed before. On the third evening, another event filled his calendar, a private networking dinner held in a high-rise overlooking the river, smaller than the gala, more selective, designed for conversations that mattered without needing an audience. And as he entered the room, the lighting softer, the atmosphere quieter, he did not scan the space out of habit. He moved through it with purpose, but without searching, as if whatever needed to happen would not require him to look for it. The dinner unfolded with the same precision he expected, conversations measured, deals hinted at without being named, the kind of environment where influence was exchanged in controlled tones rather than public displays. And Ethan moved through it seamlessly, responding, leading, guiding the direction, without effort. But there was a difference in the way he listened now, a subtle shift away from outcomes and toward intention, as if part of him was no longer satisfied with knowing what people wanted, but was beginning to notice why. It was near the end of the evening, as plates were cleared and the room settled into quieter exchanges, that he saw her again, not across the room this time, not framed by distance, but closer, moving between tables with the same calm presence, the same absence of performance. And for a moment, he did not move. He simply watched, not out of calculation, but out of recognition. Amara carried a tray, setting down glasses, exchanging brief, polite words with guests who barely registered her beyond the function she served. And yet there was something unchanged in the way she moved, something consistent that did not bend to the environment. And that consistency held his attention more than anything else in the room. He approached, not with the same directness as before, but with a slower awareness, stopping beside her as she placed a glass down. And this time, when she looked up, there was no question in her eyes, only the acknowledgement that their paths had crossed again, not by accident, but not entirely by design either. "You are working again," he said, his voice even, and she gave a small nod. "Yes," she replied, just as simply, and the exchange settled into a familiarity that had not been built, but had formed on its own. Ethan glanced briefly at the table, then back at her. "You said you go where you are done," he added, recalling her words without altering them. And there was the faintest shift in her expression, something closer to recognition than surprise. "I do," she said, and then after a beat, "This is not the same place." And the distinction was clear, not defensive, just factual. Ethan accepted that without pushing against it, without trying to redefine it. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them holding something quieter than before, less guarded, but no less defined. "I did not come here to find you," he said finally, the statement honest in a way that did not serve any advantage. And she studied him for a second, measuring not the words, but the absence of intention behind them. "I know," she answered, and that response, simple and certain, landed deeper than anything else she could have said. There was no tension in it, no challenge, just an understanding that did not require explanation. A guest at the table signaled for attention, and Amara turned slightly, responding without hesitation, finishing what she was there to do before stepping back again. And when she faced him once more, there was no expectation in her posture, no anticipation of what he might say next, just presence. Ethan noticed that, the way she existed in the moment without leaning into what might come after, and for the first time, he did not try to move the interaction forward, did not ask a question to extend it, did not offer anything to shape it. He simply stood there, allowing the moment to exist as it was. After a few seconds, Amara inclined her head slightly, a subtle acknowledgement that the interaction had reached its natural end again, and stepped away, continuing through the room without looking back. And this time, Ethan did not feel the pull to follow immediately, not because he did not want to, but because he was beginning to understand that whatever this was, it was not built through pursuit. It was built through something else entirely, something that required him to unlearn more than he had ever needed to before. And as he remained where he was, watching the space she left behind rather than chasing it, he realized that the second rule had already been broken, not in a single moment, but in the quiet decision not to control what came next. The rest of the evening unfolded without disruption, but something had already settled beneath the surface, something neither loud nor urgent, yet impossible to ignore, and Ethan Whitmore carried it with him as he moved through the final conversations, his responses precise as always, his presence controlled, but no longer anchored to the outcome of the room, because part of him had shifted its focus elsewhere, not to where she was, but to what her absence of reaction had created. When the dinner concluded and the guests began to leave in measured waves, he remained for a moment longer than necessary, watching the staff move through the space, clearing what had been used, resetting what would be needed again, and among them, Amara continued her work with the same quiet rhythm, unaffected by the weight of the room or the names it had held. This time, he did not approach immediately, not because he hesitated, but because he had begun to understand that proximity alone did not create connection, and forcing the moment would only return it to something predictable, something she would walk away from without pause. Instead, he stepped outside first, the cool night air settling against his skin, the city below reflecting in the glass panels behind him, and he waited, not with impatience, but with a stillness that felt intentional, as if for once, he was allowing time to move without directing it. Minutes passed, the soft hum of traffic filling the space, until the door behind him opened and closed quietly, and he did not turn right away. He simply registered the presence, the same way he had learned to register shifts in a room without looking. And when he finally glanced over, Amara was there, stepping out into the night, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, as if the evening had not altered anything for her at all. She noticed him, of course, but she did not react beyond that. No surprise, no question, just acknowledgement. And for a moment they stood in parallel silence, the city stretching out in front of them, both present, neither intruding. "You did not follow this time," she said after a few seconds, her voice even, and Ethan allowed a faint exhale, almost something like recognition in it. "No," he replied. "I thought I would see what happens if I do not." And the honesty in the statement was not calculated. It was simple, unguarded in a way that would have felt out of place anywhere else. Amara studied him briefly, not searching for a hidden meaning, but confirming the absence of one, and then she nodded once. "And what happened?" she asked, not as a challenge, but as a continuation of the moment. Ethan looked out toward the city lights before answering, his voice quieter than before. "Nothing I could control," he said, and there was no frustration in it, only observation, and that, more than anything, shifted the space between them again. Amara turned her gaze forward as well, following the line of his sight without needing to share his thoughts, and for a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence no longer weighted, but balanced, like something that did not require filling. "That is usually where things start," she said finally, her tone steady, and the words did not sound like advice, just truth. Ethan absorbed that without interruption, without redirecting it into something actionable, and for once, he did not respond with a solution. He simply let it exist. A car pulled up along the curb, its headlights casting a brief wash of light across the pavement before settling, and Amara shifted slightly, the movement subtle but clear, signaling that her time in this moment was nearing its natural end again. And Ethan noticed it, not as something to prevent, but as something to accept. "You are leaving," he said, not to stop her, but to acknowledge the pattern he was beginning to understand, and she gave a small nod. Yes, she answered, then after a pause. I always do when it is time. And there was no finality in it, no closure, just continuity. Ethan turned toward her slightly, not stepping closer, not reaching for the moment, just present within it. And for the first time, he chose not to ask anything, not to extend it beyond what it was, and that choice, quiet and unannounced, carried more weight than any action he could have taken. Amara met his gaze for a brief second, and there was something there now that had not been before. Not softness, not invitation, but recognition, as if she had noticed. The shift without needing it explained. Then she turned, stepping toward the car, the door opening without hesitation. And as she entered, she did not look back, not because she was closing the moment, but because she trusted that if it was meant to continue, it would not require her to hold it in place. The car pulled away, merging into the steady rhythm of the city, and Ethan remained where he was, the night air still, the lights stretching endlessly in front of him, and for the first time, he did not feel the need to follow, did not feel the urge to resolve what had not been finished, because something had already changed, not in the outcome, but in him, and as he stood there, he understood that whatever this was becoming, it would not be built by pursuit, but by presence, and that was something he had never learned until now. The next morning did not feel like a continuation. It felt like a test, not of outcome, but of restraint, and Ethan Whitmore moved through it with a precision that now carried intention beyond performance. His office filled with the quiet rhythm of controlled success, screens lit with data, voices filtered through calls, decisions made in minutes that would ripple through markets by the end of the week. Yet beneath it all, there was something else, something that no longer asked to be solved, only understood. He had not tried to find her again, not through schedules, not through systems, not through the quiet access he could have used without effort. And that choice, simple on the surface, marked the clearest shift he had made so far, because for the first time, he was allowing something to exist outside his reach without forcing it closer. By midday, the city outside his window moved with its usual urgency, cars threading through intersections, people crossing streets with purpose, everything aligned with momentum. And he watched it for a second longer than necessary before turning back to his desk, where a different kind of decision waited, one that had nothing to do with her, but everything to do with what he was becoming. He picked up his phone, paused, then set it back down without dialing, the motion small but deliberate, a refusal to act simply because he could, and instead, he chose something else, something slower. Later that afternoon, he stepped out of his building without an appointment, without a destination tied to profit or strategy, just a direction, and the walk took him through parts of the city he usually passed in silence behind tinted glass, where storefronts were smaller, conversations louder, and life moved without regard for who was watching. He stopped eventually at a corner cafe, not because it stood out, but because it did not, the kind of place that existed for those who needed it, not for those who wanted to be seen. And as he stepped inside, the air shifted from polished corporate cool to something warmer, grounded, real. He ordered coffee without looking at his watch, without checking his phone, then took a seat near the window, the chair simple, the table worn in places, and for a moment, he did nothing, just sat, letting the space exist around him without shaping it. Across the room, a quiet conversation unfolded between two people who were not trying to impress each other. A barista moved with practiced ease. A child laughed somewhere near the back, and none of it was controlled, none of it was optimized, yet it all functioned without him. And that realization did not distance him, it settled him. Minutes passed, maybe more, time moving without being tracked, and then the door opened, a small sound that would have meant nothing before, but now carried weight without effort. And he did not turn immediately, he simply registered it, the same way he had begun to register presence without needing to confirm it. And when he finally looked, she was there. Amara stepped inside with the same calm rhythm he had seen before, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, as if the world had not shifted in the slightest since the last time they had crossed paths. And for a moment, he did not move, not because he hesitated, but because he no longer felt the need to interrupt the moment as it formed on its own. She ordered quietly, exchanged a brief word with the barista, then turned slightly, and when her eyes met his, there was no surprise, no question, just recognition, the kind that did not need explanation. Ethan remained seated, not calling out, not signaling for her attention, simply present. And after a second, she walked over, not quickly, not slowly, just directly, stopping across from him without asking if she could sit, because the space between them no longer required permission to exist. "You did not look for me," she said, her voice even, and he shook his head once. "No," he replied, and there was no justification attached to it, no explanation offered, just truth. She studied him for a brief moment, then nodded slightly, as if confirming something unspoken, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was balanced, like something that had finally found its own pace. Ethan glanced out the window for a second, then back at her. "I am here because I chose to be, not because I needed to find you," he said, and the distinction was subtle, but it mattered, and Amara recognized it without asking. "Good," she said simply, and the word carried more weight than agreement. It carried acceptance, not of him, but of the moment as it was. Neither of them rushed to fill what came next. Neither of them tried to define it, and for the first time, the space between them did not feel like something to navigate. It felt like something to share, quietly, without control, without expectation, just presence. And in that stillness, something shifted again, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that when the light from the window moved slightly across the table, neither of them moved away from it. And for once, neither of them felt the need to. The moment did not announce itself. It unfolded quietly, the kind of shift that could be missed if either of them had been looking for something louder, but neither was, and that was what allowed it to happen. The cafe carried on around them with its steady rhythm, cups placed gently on tables, low conversations weaving through the air, the soft hum of a space that did not demand attention but held it anyway. And Ethan Whitmore sat across from Amara Cole, without trying to define what this was becoming, without assigning it a direction or an outcome, just present in a way that had once felt unnecessary to him. The light from the window shifted slightly across the table, touching the edge of her hand, and for a brief second, he noticed the detail without analyzing it, without turning it into something to understand, just seeing it, and that alone marked a change deeper than any decision he had made in a boardroom. Amara lifted her cup, taking a quiet sip, her movement steady, unhurried, and when she set it down, her gaze met his again, not searching, not guarded, simply there. And in that exchange, something settled between them that had not been there before, not tension, not distance, but a recognition that did not need to be spoken. "You are different today," she said after a moment, her voice even, not as a judgment, but as an observation, and Ethan allowed a faint exhale. Something close to a quiet acknowledgement of a truth he had not tried to hide. "I did not try to make this into anything," he replied, and the words carried a simplicity that would have once felt incomplete, but now felt exact. Amara studied him briefly, her eyes steady, and then she nodded once. "That is why it feels real," she said, and the sentence landed without weight, but it stayed, because it was not something he could replicate or manufacture. It was something that existed only because he had chosen not to control it. Outside, the city moved as it always did, unaware, uninterrupted, and for the first time, Ethan did not feel the need to match its pace, to stay ahead of it, to shape it. Instead, he remained where he was, letting the moment extend without forcing it forward. Minutes passed, not counted, not measured, just experienced, and in that time, nothing dramatic happened, no declarations, no turning points that could be pointed to and named, only a quiet continuation of something that had begun without permission and now existed without pressure. Eventually, Amara glanced toward the window, the subtle shift signaling that the moment, like all the others before it, would reach its natural end, and Ethan noticed it, not with urgency, not with resistance, just awareness. "You are leaving again," he said, his voice calm, not to stop her, but to acknowledge the rhythm they had fallen into, and she gave a small nod. "Yes," she answered, then after a brief pause, "but not for the same reason." And that difference, slight but undeniable, carried more meaning than anything else she could have added. Ethan did not ask what had changed, because for once, he did not need to define it to understand it, and instead he simply nodded, accepting the shift without trying to hold it in place. Amara stood, reaching for her bag, her movements unhurried, and for a second, she looked at him, not as someone passing through, but as someone who had chosen to remain without being asked. And there was something in that look, not an invitation, not a promise, but a quiet acknowledgement that this, whatever it was, had not ended. She turned then, stepping toward the door, and this time, when she reached it, she paused for just a fraction of a second, not long enough to be called hesitation, just enough to exist. Before continuing out into the city, Ethan remained seated, the space across from him no longer empty, but marked by what had been there. And as he leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the window, he understood something that had taken him longer than anything else he had ever learned, that not every connection needed to be secured to be real, not every moment needed to be extended to matter, and not every person needed to stay to leave an impact. Outside, the light shifted again, the city continuing forward without pause, and for the first time, Ethan Whitmore did not feel the need to follow it, because for once, he had found something worth staying still for, and he knew, without needing to confirm it, that when their paths crossed again, it would not be because he had forced it, and it would not be because she had waited. It would be because something between them had learned how to exist without either of them trying to control it.